We got a new one headed to the fire. Ron Rivera out in D.C.
Yeah, we knew it was going to be a busy morning, and here it is. We start with that breaking news out of the NFL. Commanders firing Ron Rivera as their head coach. Our NFL insider Jonathan Jones reporting that. 4 seasons for Rivera in Washington. He went 26-40, made the playoffs just once. That came his first season back in 2020. The Commanders are, of course, under new ownership with Josh Harris. They'll head into next season with a new coach and the number 2 pick in the NFL draft this April. So the coaching carousel truly just beginning to probably spin a little bit faster now the regular season is over. These are the coaches that have received the pink slip so far. Ron Rivera, the latest name to have his etched up here on this screen. Arthur Smith, we mentioned, happened last night. And then during the season, Brandon Staley, Josh McDaniels, and Frank Reich all were shown the door. Nothing but welcome arms welcoming in our very own QB, Matt Ryan. And Matt, you have the news coming out of Washington with Ron Rivera. There are, of course, rumblings that we thought that this might happen. Your reaction first hearing this?
Yeah, I'm not surprised. I think that when you have new ownership come in, I think there was a matter of time before this was going to happen. But to me, it speaks to a lot of these vacancies and situations, that have come open. They were never able to stabilize the quarterback position there during Ron's time, right? And so in the 4 years, kind of that revolving door and not getting continuity and not getting that position right, ultimately, in this league, that's what it comes down to. And so I'm not surprised. I think that was kind of the rumor for most of the year. Now it's going to be interesting with their number 2 pick and then trading away a lot of what they had on that defensive side of the ball. So there's cap space. You've got, good draft capital and new ownership that, seemingly wants to win and is willing to spend and do what they need to do in order to win. So it's going to be interesting to see how this one shakes out.
I was in Carolina covering the Panthers when Ron Rivera was fired back then, and one of the main things he said after he was fired was that they couldn't figure out the quarterback position after Cam Newton got injured. Of course, Sam Howell did not work out how they wanted it to in Washington. Do you look at it solely that way on offense, that wasn't the answer? But of course, Rivera is a defensive head coach, so how do you maybe piece all this together?
Yeah, it's never just one thing. There are multiple reasons why, but I think when you attempt a number of different ways to address that quarterback position, whether it was trading for Carson Wentz and that not working out, and then going with Sam Howell, who they drafted later on but had a higher draft grade on and felt good about that. But the inconsistency at that position and turning the football over specifically, was the issue. And so on the defensive side of the ball, I do think the criticism becomes, a little more valid where it's on Ron because, at the beginning of the year, I mean, you look at what they had in their front, 4, but basically they played 5 guys. And you've got Montez Sweat. And so, points per game, last on the defensive side of the ball, letting up 30.5 yards per game, last passing touchdowns given up, passer rating. Ultimately, when you're a coach that is on that side of the ball and your numbers are the way that they are, and in addition to that, you can't stabilize the quarterback position, and on top of that, you've got new ownership coming in who want their guys. They want to feel like they've hired the people that are making the decisions for the organization. It seemed inevitable. Ron's a good football coach. There's no question about that. And what he has done as a head coach in this league, specifically in Carolina, and the way he's done it with class and all those things. I know this. I played against him for a long time. I mean, he's a good football coach, but it just didn't work there. And I think, it made sense for them to make this move.
Yeah, they now will make the move and will look to hire a new coach, getting some help from our very own GM, Rick Spielman, who will help in that search for a new head coach. Now, as you look towards the future for Washington, the number 2 overall pick, do you think they clearly need to go the QB route, or what's needed for them to maybe make that next step?
Well, certainly they've got to improve on the defensive side of the ball as we saw those numbers. But, yeah, I think if they feel good about the quarterback as they go into this evaluation process, and it really all depends, the trickle down comes to what the Bears want to do with that first pick. If they feel good about what Justin Fields has done, they want to stay there. Then you talk about, is it a trade for the Commanders to get up to that one spot to get the guy that they want? Or do they feel good about multiple quarterbacks in this draft? It's going to be interesting to see. I do think they take a quarterback. I think you have to. And I think as a result of that, I think they lean probably towards taking an offensive-minded coach, right? And going in that direction of taking an offensive-minded coach. However, for me, I was drafted third to the Atlanta Falcons to a defensive-minded coach in Mike Smith. And we had good success in our first 5-6 years there together, and there was continuity there. I think the example of Houston as well, D'Amico Ryans and what he's done on the defensive side of the ball, but bringing in a young coordinator and Bobby Slowick and working with C.J. Stroud, that's a model for what they did. But more important than anything is you got to have C.J. Stroud, right? You've got to have the guy that can do it to make all of those other things work. So it'll be interesting to see what they do in their evaluation process. Certainly, I think it's a deep quarterback draft.
Yeah, we've certainly seen the blueprint happen this year, and now Washington hoping to follow that going into next season and find their QB of the future. Our QB, Matt Ryan, thank you so much for tapping in with us a little bit earlier than we planned on it. The defense, though, for Washington, a major letdown this season when you look at a guy like Ron Rivera, who hangs his hat on the defensive side of the ball. Dead last in all of these categories, and those 30.5 points per game that they allowed, the worst in a season in franchise history since 1954.
All right, I want to bring our Leger Douzable here. The breaking news of Ron Rivera out the door in D.C. And Leger, we know this was no secret. We've been talking about this for almost a month now. 4-13, their final record. 26-40 under his tenure. Haven't been to the postseason since 2020, but as an organization, they have not won a postseason game since 2005. Your just initial reaction of this news this morning?
Yeah, Brandon, it's tough, right? I just want to preference this by saying this is called Black Monday in the NFL. And we know it's a tough day, not only for head coaches, but you got to think everybody else that's involved, coordinators, assistant coaches, everybody on that staff. Once the head coach gets fired, most likely you'll be looking for work as well. So I just want to preference this before we get into this by saying this is a really tough day in the NFL for a lot of different coaches and their families. But not surprised by this happening, right? I just heard Matt Ryan talk about new ownership coming in. And I will also say, if you look at Ron Rivera, defensive-minded coach, we just had the graphic up. The defense struggled mightily this year, right? They were last in a lot of statistical categories. Brandon Flowers, they gave up 54 touchdowns, right? 30 points per game. Like, if you look at the New York Jets, a lot of people were wondering, would Robert Saleh and that staff stay? But if you look at Robert Saleh, just like Ron Rivera, he's a defensive-minded coach, right? The offense has struggled ever since Aaron Rodgers went down, but the defense kept them afloat. They were still top 10 in most statistical categories. So if your strength is defense, you can't have a defense that gives up this many points per game, this many yardage. You end up firing Jack Del Rio. Then ownership, I want to say ownership, but they decided to trade two of their best defensive players away in Chase Young and Montez Sweat. So when that trade happened, Brandon, I was like, yeah, this is kind of writing on the wall. You can expect what's going to be coming down the pipe, because when you're a defensive-minded coach, you trade away my two defensive players. When we're struggling already, you kind of know it's time for a rebuild. So not overly surprised by this happening. I think Ron Rivera was going to have to probably win like 5 out of the last 6 games to even make this a conversation. And even then, I think just because new ownership comes in, they want to hire their guy. They didn't get to hire Ron Rivera. So it looks like this team was just going to start over from square one.
You mentioned they get a chance to hire their guy, get a chance to start over. We've seen success stories like in Houston with D'Amico Ryans, a rookie head coach, and others in the league. Or do you think about going maybe more experience, assuming that Bill Belichick is let go today? You may want to go that route. If you're Washington, who is that guy? Are we thinking offense or defense, or as Pete Prisco says, a leader of men?
Yeah, at the end of the day, I'm right there with Pete. I always get enamored with people saying you need an offensive guru. You need an offensive guru. Let's just look at what's happened in the NFL this year. Look at Antonio Pierce with the Las Vegas Raiders, right? A true leader of men. You don't always need an offensive guru. You can hire an offensive guru as an offensive coordinator, right? You got to be able to have somebody with those 53 men look in his eyes. They know that he's going to lead this team, right? He's going to hold everybody accountable. And we've kind of seen the culture shift change with the Las Vegas Raiders. I mean, Brandon, I can't remember the last time they finished with a top 10 defense. Well, they did that this year with Antonio Pierce just coming in the last few games. So you need a leader of men. I know you threw out Bill Belichick's name. The question is, would he want to have GM, responsibilities as well? Because he struggled in that avenue when it comes to that in regards to picking draft picks and having draft picks actually pan out. So when you look at a situation like that, I think first and foremost, if you're the Commanders, everybody wants to, hire the hot name, right? The hot offensive coordinator, that the guy that's going to, bring all the stars in. But you got to have a leader of men first and foremost to really change the culture in Washington. I believe they're picking number 2 in the draft, so they'll probably get their quarterback of the future. You got to also bring somebody in that is going to be able to mold that young quarterback, even if he's a defensive-minded guy, right, as far as the leadership from the head coaching spot. So there's a lot that the Commanders have to do, right? They traded away their 2 best players on defense, so they're going to have some draft capital, not draft capital, but they're going to have cap money to spend money to bring in some free agents as well. And if you look at the offensive side, they have some skill position players when you look at Terry McLaurin and Jahan Dotson. So they have some pieces they can build around, right? It's about fixing that O-line, fixing that defense for sure, because they were terrible this year. And then also, when you get that quarterback of the future, do you have the right guy in place to really mold that guy?
You mentioned there $80 million cap space, I believe, will be in Washington when it comes to spending that money, and teams usually do that when they're rebuilding. You mentioned that number 2 overall draft pick, and assuming that Tim Howell is not the guy because he wasn't picked by this next head coach, we're thinking of Caleb Williams, who, by the way, is from the DMV area, so that would be a story for him. Maybe a Drake May from UNC, or maybe someone else. If it is a young QB, what needs to happen with that coaching staff, their front office, to make sure that they are going from 4-13 and maybe flipping into a contender in the future?
Well, you got to build and elevate the team around them, right? We saw the situation with the Carolina Panthers where they thought their roster was a lot better than it was for Bryce Young. And ultimately, we saw the young quarterback struggle. I remember us doing a draft show this past year, Brandon, and people were asking, each analyst, who do you think is set up for the most success? And I said C.J. Stroud. A lot of people looked at me crazy. But I said that because if you look at young quarterbacks, if you're built the right way in the trenches on the offensive line, which the Houston Texans are, right? When you got Tunsil, you got Shaq Mason, who are Pro Bowlers. He had the best offensive line out of all the rookies. So I felt like he was going to be the most comfortable in the pocket. And even when some of those guys got banged up, the backups came in and they played at a high level. Getting George Fent right before the season was monumental for the Houston Texans. So I always say this, Brandon, you got to build it from the inside out. The trenches back, right? And that's what the Houston Texans did. And they brought the Miko Ryans in. They kind of changed up that D-line and fortified that defensive line. So whoever's the number 2 pick, whether it's Drake May or Caleb Williams, you got to fortify that offensive line. You talked about the $80 million they'll have to spend. Most of that money should go to the offensive line because they have a few skill position players that can still be on that team and make an impact next year. You have to fortify the offensive line. That way that young quarterback can feel comfortable in the pocket.
We'll have to wait and see, of course, to the draft in April. So a long off season for Washington to figure out what's going to happen there. Leger Douzable, as always, appreciate you breaking down that breaking news. Ron Rivera, of course, out in D.C., taking a look at it, fired after a 4-13 season. But the bigger picture, 26-40 and 1 in 4 seasons there of the Commanders. A lot of turmoil. The last leadership there under Snyder, and of course, now Josh Harrison taking over, wanting a contender. You see it there, 0 winning seasons and 1 playoff appearance for Washington, but you see it there. It's the NFL coach. It's been hard in the NFC for him. Carolina, along with D.C., 102, 103, and 2 ties under his name as an HC.